Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is City of Heroes on the Rebirth server. Let's rant with Scrapper. We are with Psyopera level 26 Mutation Stalker, and we're talking to my favorite contact, Lori Pennington. Why is she my favorite contact? Because she's in the train station, so she's super easy to get to. She's giving us a 90-minute mission, and we're going to board the train to stop Archon Albertos and his crew. And we're going to do a Let's Rant, and this is going to be about the Bartle. What is it? The Bartle Scale, or whatever you want to call it. Um, This was brought up by Keovar, talking about the Bartle System and how Bartle was a researcher who kind of categorized players of MUDs, multi-user dungeons, which eventually came to be associated with MMOs as well, because MMOs are basically, this is an MMO, right? This is a MUD, basically. It's a graphical MUD. It's organized almost exactly the same way a MUD is, just with visuals and stuff instead of text descriptions. And so Bartle actually wrote an article in the late 1980s, early 1990s called Players Who Suit MUDs. And it was about the four different types of players that he had come to notice in his time studying people who play MUDs. So the reason he called them players that suit MUDs is because he actually described them initially as the suits of playing cards: diamonds, spades, clubs, and hearts. Right, and what he said is diamonds are like interested in achievement. Right, diamonds are treasure. Right, and so getting treasure, gaining stuff in game, whether it's levels or abilities or enhancements or you know badges or whatever. That's achievement, right? That's what the diamonds are interested in. Then you have the clubs. The clubs are in trying to impose their will on the other players, mostly through attacking them and stealing their stuff. Club being a weapon, right? These are the killers. So the diamonds are the achievers, the clubs are the killers. Killers of other player characters, right? Not interested as much in killing objects in the game. They want to defeat other players. They want to impose their will on other players. A D&D player who wants to steal from the party is acting like a club, right? Then there are the spades, the diggers, right? Spades, a shovel. The spades want to dig into the world and delve the world, and they want to learn the secrets and find out all of the stuff nobody knows. Explorers of the world. They want to be the first person to get to the top of that mountain over there that nobody ever got to, or delve to the deepest part of the dungeon and find that secret thing. They like Easter eggs. They like finding that last clue. They like digging for all of the unknowns in the world, and they find that to be really fun and enjoyable. So they're the spades, right? The diggers. And then you have the hearts. The hearts are the socializers, right? Hearts being an emotion, right? The emotion of love or friendliness or whatever you want to call it. And these are the socializers. These are people who like. How was I seen in here? These are people who like. Um, these are people who like interacting with the other players. They like, uh, you know, role playing with them, talking with them, finding out about their characters. Right? They're interested in social interaction, role play, talkie, as Luke Hart would say. And so those are the four types, right? And although he used at the beginning of the article the deck of cards suits, through most of the article he calls them achievers, the diamonds, socializers, the hearts, killers, the clubs, and explorers, the spades. And then he talks about what they want out of a game, and he has this really interesting graph, which I was trying to type out in email, but you can't do it here. So let's do it like this, right? There's two axes this way and two axes this way, right? And this axis is the players to world axis. So we're in the center. Going this way is doing something with players. And I would say for TTRPGs, characters, both PC and NPC, because the DM is unlike a MUD, where if you want to interact with other players, you have to interact with player characters because all the NPCs are controlled by a computer. In a tabletop role-playing game, all the NPCs are controlled by another player called the DM. So interacting with players includes both PCs and NPCs. So characters would be over here for tabletop, but it's players in the article. On this side, we have the world. So this is where you're interacting with the environment, right? We're doing this right now. I am entirely over here interacting with the world. There are no other player characters in this mission. This axis is acting and interacting. So up here, you're acting on something, and down here, you're interacting with something. Acting means imposing your will, essentially, on the thing. And interacting means interacting with it, but not necessarily impositionally, right? You're not imposing anything. And so we have these quadrants. So in this quadrant here, world, act. Somebody wants to act on the world. This is the achiever. The achiever wants to impose their will on the world by climbing to the top of the leaderboard, by getting to the first, like the guy in City of Heroes on launch day who got to 40th level on the first day using the burn exploit was acting on the world to be the first guy. He was achieving, right? So that's someone trying to act on the world, to impose their will on the world. That's an achiever. If your characters are clearing a hex and building a stronghold and taming the wilderness like that, that's achievement. They're imposing their will on that hex. Act on the world. On this side, we're acting on other players in a MUD or other characters in a role-playing game. Acting on other characters is killer, right? You're imposing your will on another character. You're attacking the NPC. You're attacking the character. You're stealing from the party. That's imposing your will on the other players or on the DM, right? So a killer is someone acting on the players, and an achiever is acting on the world. Then down here, we have interacting, right? Down at the bottom. A socializer is over here. They're interacting with other players, right? So this is somebody owns a tavern and they're interacting, right? Their activity in game is to buy a tavern and then interact with all the people who come into the tavern. And then over here, we have the world and interacting, and we have the diggers here, the explorers. They're interacting with the world. They're not trying to impose their will on the world, right? They're not trying to make the world theirs. They're just trying to find out all the secrets of the world and interact with it, right? So that's kind of how he laid it out, right? Achievers want to act on the world. Explorers want to interact with the world. Killers want to act on other players or characters, and socializers want to interact with other players or characters. And so that's the Bartle sort of, that's how Bartle defined these things. And you can take the Bartle test. They go online. By the way, I don't think Bartle wrote any of these. These are people who read his article and then made a test. So I don't know how accurate he thinks they are. I think they're pretty good. You can take the Bartle test, and I end up as SEA or ESA. And the reason it's either or is because I'm basically E equals S greater than A, and then K is way off nowhere. I'm not. Killing is like being a killer. I don't care. I'm not trying to act on other characters. Right, so what you can see is the fact that I'm both S and E at the top means I am an interactor rather than an actor. Right? I like interacting with the world rather than acting upon it. I like interacting with other characters rather than imposing my will upon them. Now, that doesn't make me better or worse than anybody. There's no right way to play these games. But by knowing that I'm either ES or SE at the top, that tells me that I'm an interactor. And my guess is, watching my Let's Plays, listening to my Let's Rants, this probably doesn't surprise anybody. And now the reason I'm talking about this is that Keovar talked about the Bartle system, the Bartle scale, and we've had a little bit of back and forth in the comments, but I was like, my gosh, I know this like cold. I've read this article many times, and I talked about it with other people when we were building our own mud and mush and stuff like that. So I know this whole article cold. I was able to recite all of this without looking at it again years later, but I never thought to apply it to the conversations we've been having in these Let's Rants about things like whether you want to play in a sandbox game, whether you want to, whether you want to have story arcs, whether you want to have your background, and like all of that stuff, I think is related to the Bartle system and what he's talking about with these suits and which player you are. Um, so that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. If you think about, for instance, what have I been saying I really like? Oh, these sort of old school hex crawl, sandbox, west marches. You go out into the unknown and you discover what's there. Well, what is that? That's exploring, right? That's interacting with the world. And that's one of the things I think is super cool. That's what I'd like to do, right? That's awesome. On the other hand, if you think about like my best friend, who I've talked about a few times, where he's like plans his character out from level 1 to level 20, and he goes through the Dungeon Master's Guide, spoilerizing the whole thing for himself. Well, that's spoilers, right? Because you're not giving yourself a chance to dig. You're just reading it. There's no exploration there, right? But what's he doing? He's achieving, right? He's making a list of all the things he wants for his character and trying to impose his will on the world by having the character get all of the magic items that he saw in the book that he wants and checking off all the boxes. That's an achiever, right? He's trying to act on the world, right? And by the way, he also tried to act on other characters, not by killing them, but when he planned out his whole character and tried to exert control, right? Acting, not interacting. And what he wanted to do was have the other player characters respond to his character in a certain way. And the way the roleplay went, they just didn't. And the way the roleplay went, I guess he felt very unsatisfied with how the rest of the characters and maybe the NPCs were reacting to his character. Like, you're not treating me like the suave, debonair ladies' man that I wanted everybody to treat my character like. So there's obviously something wrong with my roleplay, and he wanted to reboot his character. And I'm not going to get into the details of what he wanted to do. I think I've mentioned that in previous Let's Plays. It's not really relevant. The relevant part is why. Why was he's trying to act on the world and on the other players. He's trying to get the world to work the way he wants it to work. Because he's an achiever, right? He's a diamond in the suits. And he's trying to act, up in this quadrant, act upon the world, right? And on the other characters, both player and NPC. Again, not to like steal from them or kill them, but and he would never say he wanted to like tell somebody how to role play, but he became frustrated that the other players weren't reacting to his character the way at the beginning of the game he had pictured his character would be reacted to. And instead of trying to interact, right, and letting whatever result happen, he was trying to control that, right? The acting part is about control. You're trying to control the game if you're acting on the world, or you're trying to control the other players if you're acting on the other player. Remember one of the definitions, the imposition of your will on the other players or on the game world, right? And again, this isn't a bad thing, right? It's just about how much control you want. Whereas on the social and explorer side, not only aren't those players trying to control the world, but we actually feel like when we control the world, there's less value, right? To know everything is kind of harming the experience. I talked in a previous video right before this about my solo gaming experience using Mythic GM Emulator and the Fate chart and the Chaos ranks and stuff. And I'm enjoying the system in part because of all the randomness that happens. Scenes get interrupted or altered quite frequently, especially as Chaos goes up. And, early on I was like constantly trying to find ways to do things to keep my character in control, to make the Chaos go down so that the things would favor her. And I started to realize, that's not as much fun. When the Chaos is high, scenes keep getting interrupted, and the interruptions lead to cool stuff. At one point, we had an interrupted scene that was like just the result was basically something surprising but irrelevant to any current plots happens, and it was like basically a random character death, but it couldn't be a character I already knew. So I decided, well, I was walking past the keep. I decided the baronet or the baroness of the keep had died, and there was a herald outside telling of the death, and it turned out to be randomly it was the baroness, the wife. And then I asked the fate chart: are people mourning her, or did they dislike her? Well, it turns out she's Marie Antoinette. Basically, they hate her, and they're not sad that she's dead. And I don't know, maybe she was assassinated, but it's not part of any plot. It's just a random thing that happened in the city that I created, and it's just a cool thing. And I really liked that scene because it was completely out of nowhere, and it was a surprise. And then I could interact with it. My character, who's a paladin, went down on one knee and genuflected and made, a little prayer, even though she herself doesn't really like this baroness, but she is a good paladin, so she's going to be, nice. And so my point is, that's because I like interacting. I'm not trying to control what happens. I'm just trying to see what happens. I feel like my best friend would utterly despise Mythic GM Emulator and doing random rolls like that, because he keeps trying to control things, right? He wants it to go a certain way, and when it doesn't, he gets frustrated. He pictures, I think he's got too much enthusiasm, maybe, and he's too excited about the game. And even when he's not playing the game, he's fantasizing about the game. In between sessions, he's thinking about what's going to happen in the next session, and he kind of plans it all out. And then when it doesn't happen the way he pictured it, he gets frustrated and disappointed because he's trying to control it, right? He's trying to act on the world to get it to come out because it's such a cool story in my head. This story was so cool in my head. It should be good. It should work out. It should be awesome. And then when it doesn't work out, he gets frustrated, right? Because he's trying to exert that control. Now, I'm not saying he's wrong, right? I'm just saying it's a different mindset. And some people want that control. And you can have that control, but it can lead to maybe railroading, right? And I think that happens a lot, right? And so why does this have implications for the game? Well, if you're a GM who's an actor who likes to have that control, you're going to be much more likely to create adventures that are linear. Not necessarily railroads, but are linear, right? Because you're trying to control the pace of the narrative. And you probably feel, if I can control it, it'll be really cool because I have some great ideas. And it probably will be cool. I mean, it might be really fun. But if you have a bunch of players who are interactors and don't want all that control, they might be frustrated. You're going to get complaints that even though it's a linear game and not a railroad, you're going to get complaints that it's a railroad, right? Because to someone who wants to interact, having all that control, even though it's not a railroad, it's just linear, might feel railroady because they want the interaction and not the control. And so this is where I think it's actually worth thinking about and talking about, and maybe even worth it in your game group to say, let's all take turns individually going onto one of these websites that has the Bartle Test and take the Bartle Test and see where we come out. And the most important thing is not whether it's ESA or SEA or AKS, but remembering that E and S means interact, and A and K means act, right? E and S means interact with the world without imposing control, and K and A means imposing control on things, right? And figure out whether your group wants to interact or act. And then, do they want to act on the world or act on characters? If you have a bunch of people who want to impose their will on characters, then as a GM, you would probably put a lot of combat in the game. Or a lot of opportunities to do things like steal from enemies, like run a thieves guild. And your thieves are going around pickpocketing the town and bringing down governments and all that stuff. That's imposing their will on other characters, right? If you have people who want to act on the world, then you might have them build a stronghold and tame the wilderness and impose their will and eventually create a little barony or a duchy or a mini country, maybe even a kingdom. Maybe they come to rule the kingdom. Now they're imposing their will on the world, right? On the other hand, if you have interactors, then you have players who don't want to impose their will but just want to interact. So they might want to explore a dungeon, but they wouldn't want to conquer it. Right? They might want to interact with the NPCs, but they don't want to dominate them or steal from them or murder them. And so it's really important to know this And I think it can affect very strongly the structure of how you design your game and how you build your world and so forth. And so my recommendation, I don't think we're going to do this mission. Maybe we will. So my recommendation to you is at least talk about these matters with your players. But you can ask people, and I was actually planning to do this. Do you want to do more, um, like rank, social, combat, exploration, achievement? But the problem with when getting people to rank this is when you ask this question of the person, we're actually, as people, when asked spontaneously this, not great at self-assessing, right? You can easily say, what's your favorite color? But saying, like, what's your favorite activity in the game and why, rank them, like, I think that's a little harder. We're not great at self-assessing, and sometimes it's better to take a diagnostic test like the Bartle Test. The Bartle Test will ask you things like, would you rather own a tavern or steal from another player, right? Would you rather find a room in a dungeon that no one else has ever found, or get to max level, right? And these are obviously asking questions about achieving, but by phrasing it that way, they make it much more concrete to a player than just, do you like to achieve? It's not just, do you like achieving better? It's like, if you had the opportunity to explore a dungeon nobody explored and find cool stuff, or to get to max level, which would you rather do? And by doing a series of these dichotomous questions, they come up with your final score. And again, I would argue it's not just ESAK or whatever that you need, but it's thinking about whether you end up on the action side or the interaction side. And it might be, for instance, like you might be SAKE, right? And that's social, which is interacting players, and then A is acting on the world. So now you have somebody who's like got feet in all the quadrants. This person might be either easier or harder to please than others. And so I think it's worth knowing for your players who likes which thing, and whether you guys are all similar or whether there are a lot of differences. And then, like, what I might actually do, I imagine a couple of the players would say, I don't have time to do this, but what I might actually do is ask the players to take the Bartle Test and say, just think in terms of D&D, and when they're talking about killing other players, just think about killing characters like NPCs and stuff, and let them answer those questions and give me the results. And then in session 0, actually talk about it. And look, the way this group is constituted, right, best friend, you are an actor and very much an achiever, but all the rest of us are interactors and explorers. And this is going to make it very hard for me to cater to the party adventures, because what the rest of us like to do is interact with the world, and what you want to do is impose your will on the world. And you can't both interact and impose your will. They're kind of mutually exclusive. So what do we do going forward, right? We might need to have a conversation, and I don't know whether my best friend would end up that way. I'm guessing he's an achiever based on a lot of what I've seen of him. But I think he's also a socializer, and he's also an explorer. I mean, like, I know he likes all of these activities. We sort of all like all of them a little bit, other than maybe PvP. But we certainly like combat. All of us do. So we all like all of the activities a little bit. The question isn't, do you like them at all? It's, what do you like the most? And what do you want to focus your activities on? And what should we focus the game world on and the campaign on, right? And so I don't know if I'm going to make them take the Bartle Test. I'm certainly going to ask them to rank at least what their favorite thing to do is. And then I'm going to ask them to do this ahead of time, and then in session 0, we're going to talk about it. I'm going to tell them, don't do it in public. Just email me your answers. And then we come up with the answers, right? Because I don't want them to be influenced by what each other is saying. I'm going to say, okay, here are the answers, right? We have, 4 of us said this and 2 of us said that. And, like, I want you to see now what my job is going to be like as a GM, because you've asked me for all these different things that kind of mutually exclude each other. And so I can't give you everything all at once. Like, I can't please you all at the same time because some of these are mutually exclusive, right? Acting on players and interacting with them are mutually exclusive. A killer trying to impose their will on another player is very different from a socializer just trying to interact. And I can't necessarily have a scene where you do both. Because as soon as the actor tries to impose their will, the interaction ends and you're in a combat or somebody's being murdered or stolen from or something like that. And now it's not an interaction anymore. Now it's an imposition, right? And acting instead of interacting. And so what I would say is, I'm really glad Keovar brought this up because I think this is really important stuff. And it's what leads to the differences that we see in role-playing games and what people want to get out of the role-playing game. Think about, go back to my discussions. I mean, several of them. Mother May I, right? This is about imposition of will, right? That players don't like having to ask the GM for permission to do their powers, right, or their abilities. What are you saying? I want to act on the world rather than interact with it, right? So I complained about this. I don't like this. Why? Because I'm an interactor, right? Remember, E and S at the top means I'm on the interaction side of the scale. I like interacting with the world, and I like interacting with other players and characters, but I like interacting, not imposing my will, right? And so with Mother May I, right, this is a way for the player character to impose their will on the world rather than interacting with it. This rule says I get a sneak attack whenever I want as a bonus action. I don't want to have to position myself into flanking and interact with the world before I do it, right? Just to use a simple example. And so I think, that's where that comes from. And my sort of dislike of the getting rid of the Mother May I rules is that I'm disliking that they're kind of getting rid of the interacting rules and replacing them with acting rules, right? Acting on the world. And there's actually nothing directly wrong with that. It's just that I'm an interactor. And I don't like it when the interaction stuff gets kind of subordinated to the acting, right? And again, not acting like being an actor on a play, but being an imposer of your will. And so I think I go back to the James Hike article. There should be 3 story arcs. What is that about? Well, that's kind of about achieving, right? Achieving the story arc, finishing the story arc, imposing your will on the story arc, in a sense, right? There's a story arc, it goes to a climax and then crashes to the end in a denouement. It's a particular structure, and you're just sort of acting on the world, right? You're not really interacting with it, because interacting implies discovery and finding out, and, well, the story arc is already there. This is the GM acting, right? Imposing their will on the game with the storylines, right? There are 3, and they will be intertwined. And you decided that ahead of time before you ever did any interacting with the players, right? And you picked their backgrounds, and you decided how those backgrounds are intertwined with these 3 storylines before you did any interacting with the players. So now you're acting on the world. You're acting on the other players as the GM, right? Rather than interacting with them and finding out what they're interested in or what story arcs interest them and doing those. You already planned it out, right? That's imposing your will. And again, it's not necessarily wrong. But if you have a bunch of players who want to interact and be interacted with, and you're acting on them, again, it can feel very railroady. It can feel very forced because the players are interested in interacting and the GM is acting. And so I think a lot of these can be seen in this context. I know that Keovar said, well, Bartle has resisted the translation of these things outside of the world of MUDs, and I don't even know if he agrees with using them with MMOs. Didn't I kill this guy? I guess I must not have. I don't even know if he agrees on talking about them with MMOs, because he originally did this in 1989, before there were MMOs, with MUDs, right? And mushes and stuff. And he really just did MUDs. I don't even think he did mushes. And I don't think he has a huge amount of data. I think he just was in a news group and they were discussing this, and then he interviewed a few people, 30 or 40 people, and then came up with this idea that folks agreed with. The people who were part of the community said, yeah, this sounds right. Um, I think it's brilliant analysis. Obviously, nobody falls perfectly in any one of these categories, and like I said, I like all of the activities to some degree, other than actual PvP. But I think it's very good at sort of broadly categorizing the activities, and I particularly like the graph and the acting and interacting parts, and the whether it's on players and world. And I think that it can be very useful to use this terminology to kind of discuss with each other what are our likes and dislikes, and what are our preferences, and what are we looking to get out of from a game. My best friend asked me this at one point, and I baffled him. He said, "What are you looking to get out of from a role-playing game?" And I said, "Well, what I'm looking now, and what I'm actually looking for now, I would say, is interaction with the world and with the other players." But I hadn't thought about it in these Bartle terms yet, because Keovar hadn't mentioned it, and I forgot all about this. I said, how did I say this to him? Let me actually look up. I'm going to pause here. I'm going to look up exactly how I worded it. All right, so here's what started it. He wrote, when playing in a D&D campaign based upon your experience as a player, he asked all of us this, or reading novels or watching shows or series or movies, would you prefer it? Now, I would say mistake number one. We're not reading a novel. We're not watching a show. We're not watching a movie. This is a game, and what we like in novels or movies or shows is irrelevant. So I would argue with him about that. But he said, which of these do you prefer? Do you prefer if, one, it revolves primarily around your character's action and their backstory? The story is essentially your story. Okay? This is me imposing my story on the world. Believe it or not, that's an achiever, right? Two, have an overall plot that occurs regardless of which characters are involved. The story is about the plot, which the characters experience, and have some influence over how things turn out. That is interaction. This is an explorer, right? The digger interacting with the world, and maybe other characters, but that's interaction, right? Three, be a mix of plot and character focus, such that the characters' backstories are integrated to the overall plot. This is like do it all, right? So that's his question, but I wasn't thinking in terms of Bartle. I answered that in tabletop role-playing games, I am most interested in the forward story. That is, the story of the party or the campaign from session one on, not my character's backstory. Why? The backstory, being the story of the campaign, is me acting on the world, and I like to interact, right? Didn't say that, but that's what I wrote. I said I just use the backstory as a way to get my character started. And I'll say, though, that it all depends on the campaign. If the DM says, let's do a character-driven campaign that's all about minding your backstories, then clearly I'd make up more than just something to start with. He then said, so what is your ideal experience? This is personally to me, he said. So what is your ideal experience for you as a player, and for whatever your character for whatever character you may play in my upcoming campaign, what do you want? Maybe you said enough in this answer. And I said, I mean, we can talk about that in chat at some point if you want. But he never seems to want to. I don't want to write a novel, ironically, about not writing long backstories. Your option one in the thread is confounding two things. Yes, I like the actions of the characters to be important and to matter, but that's not as same as the backstory being the central focus. What am I saying here? I want to interact with the world, not impose my backstory on it, right? Interact, not act. But again, I wasn't thinking in terms of Bartle, or I would have said that. Then I said, I'm going to remind you that when we started, I gave two options, one being Rome, where the main story was the world story, and you guys are participating in it, and the other being Age of Chaos, where everything was built around the characters, and the group unanimously chose Rome. It may be that having done that once, people will want the other option. He then said, basically, I'm asking, along with what I posed in the conversation, what you asked me before you created your campaign. What do you want to get out of it as a player and your character? I didn't actually ask him that. I said, what's one thing you've never done that you've always wanted to do in D&D? What's your favorite thing to do in D&D? And what are your pet peeves? And his answer was, my favorite thing to do is level up. And what I've never done is got to level 20. Achiever! That's achiever, right? So I then said, as a player, so I said, I can't say what my character would want yet, because I don't know who I'm going to play, but as a player, I know it sounds corny, but I want to experience a shared fictional universe. What is that? Interaction. I want to interact with the other players, and I want to interact with the world in a shared fictional universe. Why did I say it that way? Because a mush, which I had many years of experience and loved for many years, multi-user shared hallucination. You enjoy it by participating in the collective shared hallucination that what's going on is real to the characters, the shared fictional universe. He then said, "Can you elaborate?" He didn't seem to understand this. Now, I don't know if maybe he just didn't get the phrasing, or if he's thinking so much as an actor that he doesn't understand what I'm saying, is that I want to interact with the world and the other characters and the players, but not impose my will or my backstory on them. Right? He then said, "Can you elaborate?" And I said, "I'm not really sure how else to describe it. Playing a role playing game, we build a shared story together as we go. What is that? Interaction." Right? That's what I like to get out of it, I said. But that explains why I'm not a fan of long, intricate, detailed backstories, but prefer the stories to be made up at the table. The backstory I bring to session one is not shared. It's an action, not an interaction, right? I'm imposing it on the party. I wrote this big long backstory saying that I came from Krypton and I'm the most powerful guy as long as I'm exposed to the sun and I'm the only survivor of my race and blah, blah, blah. That's imposing all of that on the other players without their permission because they weren't part of the backstory. That's not an interaction, that's an action. Right? And so I want something that's not what I made up alone. And what my friend does is he makes up these characters all by himself. And then he tries to bring them into existing campaigns or new campaigns and play them as written. Because he's, I believe, an actor rather than an interactor. And that's why he asked the questions the way he did. Right? Because he wants to know what we want, but he's coming at it from a framework of he likes to impose his will on the universe, to shape it to the purposes of his character, to make the universe get his character where he wants it to go, which is level 20 with these magic items and whatever. And I think he's assuming all of us do the same thing because he's so steeped in this action mode, acting on the other characters, not other play, again, it's not PvP, but acting on the other characters, acting on the world, instead of interacting with the other characters and interacting with the world. Right? It's a very subtle difference, right? Because acting and interacting feel like they're the same thing, but the acting is about the imposition of your goals and wills and decisions on the world or on the other characters or players, and interacting is about finding out and discovering them, not imposing your will upon them, right? Finding out about a cool NPC and learning the cool NPC's backstory is interaction, right? Walking into the NPC shop and stealing gold from them while they're not looking is action rather than interaction, right? I mean, in the vernacular, that could be called a negative interaction, right? But in the Bartle sense, right, of imposing versus digging, right? Socializers dig into the social interactions and explorers dig into the environment, but they don't necessarily try to control it or shape it or make it go somewhere. And killers and achievers are not digging into those things, but trying to force them to their mode, right? To act on them, to get them to do something, right? To impose their will. So bringing a big giant backstory into the game and then trying to make the other role players play about it and acknowledge it and believe in it is an acting rather than interacting, right? Whereas if you bring no backstory, say, I'm not going to bring a backstory to the game, just very little. I was a farmer whose cattle were killed, and I just picked up arms and went to go fight the goblins who killed the cattle, and now I'm a fighter, right? It's not much of a backstory. And other than maybe you like cows, there's not much there. And then you can react to whatever is going on at the table, right? That's the interacting. And so I think that these are two very different modes. And it's worth having a conversation like my friend and I started to have, and then he got distracted, and we never actually went beyond that part of the conversation, which disappointed me. What I really wanted him to do was agree to like get into a Discord like verbal discussion, and we could actually talk about it because I wanted to discuss this in greater length with him because I think it bears discussion, it bears conversation, and the more we think about this higher level of what we want out of a game, the more likely we are to find a way to play with each other that works. So he's acting in he is operating in a very active actor achiever mode as a player and possibly as a DM. And that's okay, even if all the rest of us are interactors, kind of as long as we know it and we can adjust, right? We know we're in a world with a GM who is an actor who's trying to sort of get, who expects us, not so much that he's going to impose his will on us. I don't think he would want to do that. But who's going to try to get us to want to impose our will on the world. And if we're a group of players who don't want to do that, right? Imagine a GM who's like an actor, he's very much into this, and he's like, let's build a stronghold, and you guys can like clear out all these hexes, and we can do all this cool stuff where you tame the environment. If the players are interactors, they might say, yeah, we don't really want to do that. We're not interested in strongholds. Now, I'm an interactor, but I love the idea of, as a player, I love the idea of strongholds. So even though I don't want to impose my will most of the time, I think strongholds are kind of cool. I think I come at it from the discovery of how the stronghold is going to develop and grow, right? I wouldn't want to have an existing castle. I'd want to start with like a little hill fort. And over time, build it and expand it and add modules to it or whatever you do, depending on the game system, to make a cool stronghold. And essentially discover how the stronghold is going. That's almost like an exploration, right? Discover how the stronghold is going to come out. So my mode is always in the interacting. That's clearly what I like. And it looks like my best friend is really kind of more on the acting side, right? And again, not acting like a theater actor, but acting on the world and imposing his ideas onto the world to shape it into what he wants. And I think that explains why, like, for example, I think I mentioned this in one of my videos a long time ago, like Quintessence Last. He was joining an in progress Princes of the Apocalypse game, which is set in the Forgotten Realms. And he made up this character who's like a Tempest Cleric Genasi, Air Genasi or something, who was going to be a once in a generation scion of Thor that is born in her village. And I was like, dude, do you know if this GM in the Forgotten Realms even has Thor? Because he's not a Forgotten Realms god. Do you know if he wants that god in his world? Well, I don't like any of the storm gods in the Forgotten Realms. Like, well, that's fine, but you don't get to decide what gods are in the world. But I need it for my backstory. And your character is now the most important character in your village, and you're a once in a generation like chosen one. Like, this sounds like main character syndrome, but it's not. It's not entirely. I mean, I think there's a little of that there, but it's because he's an actor, right, rather than an interactor, and he's trying to impose that storyline on the game so that he can play it because he thinks it'll be fun. Now, I will say, I'm sure he thinks it'll be fun for them too, and he has a little bit of DM brain because he's a very good DM, and he's probably trying to come up with a story that he thinks will be cool to have played out at the table. He's not trying to ruin anybody's fun, right? But if the other players are interested in the interacting, and he's trying to do this acting, this imposition, that can lead to trouble. And I said I wouldn't do this because you're kind of imposing all this on the other players. I think this is actually a really interesting conversation, and I'm really glad Keovar brought it up because I hadn't really thought about it in Bartle terms, but I think you really can. I know Bartle, again, kind of rejected this idea, but I disagree with him. I think that the nature of a player is either to be more focused on the world or the players, the characters, right? And more focused on acting and imposing or interacting and not imposing. And it's definitely true for me. I like both interacting with players and the world, but I'm not so much interested in the imposition of my will on the world as a player. Now, as a GM, I'm an interactor, so I'm starting to see the value of things like Mythic GM Emulator and random rolls and, just explore the world and see what happens. And that's what I'm going to start doing more of, because I've done a lot more self-assessment and see that this is what I like. But when I was running the Rome game, it was acting. I imposed the world story on the world, and they played it. And they interacted with it, and the story interacted with them, but it was an imposition. Now, as I said in the messages I was reading, I gave them an option of an active world, an action, and like in a world where I'm acting, or a world where they're interacting, right? They're being acted on or interacting, and they picked the one where it's acting rather than interacting. Now, they chose that, where I was imposing the story on them. They asked for it. In fact, my best friend insisted on it, and now I know why. Right? It's really interesting because he insisted on it, and then afterwards, throughout the campaign, he was always complaining that I wasn't getting his backstory and the other characters' backstories in it enough. He's an actor, so he insisted on a world story that was imposed, right? But he then wanted to act on that world story with his backstory and impose his will onto it, right? Which is sort of like, that's clash, right? That clashes. It's sort of really hard to do. The other players asked for the imposition of the world story that I did, and then they just accepted it and didn't keep asking me for stuff, right? But that's because I feel if they take this test, they're all going to be interactors. I think they're all going to be ES or SE like I am as the first two. And so I think, I mean, I might be wrong about this, but I think if we all took the Bartle test, my best friend would be the odd man out. That the rest of us would all be at the bottom of the graph in the interaction section. And he's going to be at the top of the graph in the action section. And again, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but it's a good idea to know it, and especially if one person is different from the rest of the group, you need to know it. And one little last story. Again, this goes back years. My best friend, I've told this story, played this halfling named Seth, who was based on the Kender Tasselhoff, and was always kleptomaniac, stealing from our party in first edition AD&D, and drove the rest of us nuts. We hated it. We hated Seth, and we were really ticked off at my best friend for doing this. He didn't ask if it was okay, and he knew we hated it. Like, he knew we hated it, and he kept doing it. And he could not understand why we didn't just think it was cool and fun and go with it. Just go with it. Why? Why did he think it was okay, and why were we struggling? Because he's an actor, and he was acting on the party, literally imposing his will on us by pickpocketing us. And in AD&D, there was no way to stop it. The thief just makes a roll, and he had a good roll once he was 5th or 6th level. He had 70% chance to pickpocket, and he just rolled it, and he succeeded. And there was no way to stop him. Couldn't do it. It wasn't an opposed roll. So you couldn't get a high enough perception to stop him. He just could do it, no matter what. And he was imposing his will on us and kleptomaniac stealing stuff from us. We were mad. Why? Because we were, maybe all of us, I'm an interactor. And I don't mind interacting with your character, but I don't want you imposing your character's will on me. And that was frustrating to us. So he couldn't understand. We were mad because he was imposing his will on us. And he didn't think it was a problem because I don't think he would have minded if we had imposed our will back. When the paladin picked Seth up by his fuzzy feet, hung him upside down, and shook him until all the stolen treasure came out of his belts. My best friend, who was role-playing Seth at the time, narrated all the stuff that came out. He thought it was fun to do that. Now this guy, the paladin, is imposing his will on Seth and shaking all the stolen treasures out. My best friend had no problem with that because as someone who enjoys action on things, I don't think he minds being acted upon. That's his mode, and so he's okay with that. You see? And so, again, I think it's a really good idea to talk about it because as kids we didn't know anything about Bartle or any of that stuff. But it might have been really helpful if we had stopped the session and talked about this and said, buddy, the three of us are interactors and don't want to impose our will on other people or the world, and we don't like having your will imposed on us. It's 3-1. You're going to need to learn to compromise and not do this stuff. Right? And having talked it out, he might have said, oh, I get it now. I understand why it's not fun for you. Because I'm forcing a mode of play on you, acted on, imposition of will that you don't find fun. And maybe after talking about it, we could have said, well, look, we understand that you like this. So let's have an agreement. Once every 3 sessions, Seth can steal something. But the other 2 sessions, you cut it out. So that we don't have to deal with it all the time. Every damn session. Right? And now we can all have fun. He can impose his will on us a little bit. We laugh it off since we know that's what's fun for him. And the other couple sessions, he doesn't do it because he knows it annoys us as an imposition of his will. Right? And so this is why it's really important to talk about this stuff. And I think that if I ever run a game again, we're going to talk about this stuff. I don't know if I'm going to make them take the Bartle test because, again, it's mainly about muds and mushes and maybe MMOs, and so I don't know how relevant they'll think it is. And I don't know if the old one that I used to take is still linked. It was a very good one, but it was in the 90s. I don't know if it's still around. If anybody knows of a good one, put the link in the comments so that people can take it. I haven't searched for it. I didn't do my homework before I shot this video, but I think that it's really worth talking about this stuff. And if there's a mismatch in your group, find it out in session 0. Before session 0, do it before, and then when you come to session 0, talk about it. Say, how are we going to handle it? Doesn't mean we can't play together if you're an actor and the rest of us are interactors, or vice versa. But if 4 people want to impose their will in the world and 1 person just wants to interact with it, let's talk about how do we deal with it. How do we make it so that everybody can have fun? And usually what it means is we do some things one day and some things another day, right? Everybody has a little fun one session or the other session. If it's 50-50, it's half and half. If it's 4 people want one thing and 1 person wants the other, well, the person who's the odd man out is going to have to understand that maybe 3 out of 4 sessions aren't going to be the things that they want to do. But every once in a while, so maybe you have a party. I want to impose my will on the world and everybody else wants to interact. Well, let's build a stronghold. And we'll make your character the castellan of the stronghold. And we'll let you work with the GM to do all of that management. And the rest of us will, share the stronghold with you and role play about it. And we'll help you fund it. But we'll go out and explore the world and get the treasure to fund it. And you can worry about the stronghold. And that'll be fun for you. Not that this guy's not going to come on the adventures. He'll come too, right? But then he gets to do the imposition in a fun way on the world, get that achievement, build that stronghold, 1 tower and 1 keep and 1 wall and moat and drawbridge at a time, and watch it getting bigger and bigger on the map, and the hexes around it being cleared more and more, and that's that achievement, right? Imposing on the world. And the rest of us, yeah, we'll role play about that, but we won't get into the nitty gritty. You do that with the GM, right? And the rest of us will do the exploring and the interacting, and we'll interact with all the NPCs that you attracted to our stronghold as retainers and stuff, and learn about their backstories and their families, and help them free their daughter from falling down the well, and get their livestock saved from the chupacabra or whatever it is, right? And that's the fun interacting we get to have, and you can do the imposition of your will in the stronghold. And now you've got a probably very happy game group who at first it would seem shouldn't play together. Yeah, you can, but you got to talk about it. And you've got to work it out. And so I think it's important to know where everybody stands. So I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know if it's going to be just tell me what you like, or if it's going to be Bartle Test, or maybe predict what you like, but take the Bartle Test and see if it comes out the same way. I'm not sure. But somehow or other, I want to have this higher level discussion. Because if I'm an interactor and I want to run an interactive world, not a world where people are imposing and being imposed on, and my best friend wants to be imposed on and impose, right? That is going to cause an issue. And I think it did a little bit in their own game. And if I run more of a sandboxy open world interactive, I think it's going to be even more so. Like, don't give me a magic item wish list. I have no idea what's going to be in magic item treasure. I only roll randomly. He would hate that. Why aren't you putting the magic items that are useful for our characters into the game? Because I'm an interactor, not an imposer. And I want to just see what happens rather than tell you what happens. Right? Again, I don't know if he would even understand that unless I really sit down to explain it to him, because he's so much in the mode of control and the control over the story. He thinks that's how you get a good story. And I mean, you can. I got a pretty good story out of Rome, but I think I would have gotten a better story if I'd started with a blank slate and just come up with whatever I came up with and interacted with the players. And so at least I would have had one I would have liked better. Right? Now, he's an actor, so maybe he wouldn't have liked it as much. Right? Don't know. So anyway, that's something really important to think about. And again, Keovar, thanks for that comment. I love my commenters. I don't have a lot of them, but you guys are awesome. You guys are better than any 100 commenters because you always put really thoughtful and insightful comments that make me want to like make new videos and talk about this stuff again and rant some more. So I mean, I didn't know when I started this if I would get through 10 Let's Rants, but there have been enough comments that have given me ideas that we're well over 20 now, and we're probably going to keep going. Until next time, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been City of Heroes. Let's Rant with Scrapper on the Rebirth server.